We're at Masechet Pesachim, Daf Samech Bet 62. We are dealing with this interesting case of someone who slaughters the Pesach sacrifice, but there's a problem with his intention. There's all kinds of different ways that a person can have wrong intention. Some of them are valid, and some of them make the Pesach invalid. So we're continuing to talk about a case where he has intention that when I do the zirikah, when I sprinkle the blood, that will be for uncircumcised people. And this Korban Pesach will atone for them as well, even though they're not part of the group and I cannot slaughter it for them, but I want it to be effectual when I sprinkle on their behalf that they can receive atonement, even though they're uncircumcised and cannot take part in a Pesach sacrifice. Is that okay or not? We have two opinions. Rabbah says it's valid. The reason is because uncircumcised people are not within the category of a Korban Pesach. And therefore, it's like making a Korban for Mickey Mouse, right? Mice cannot bring Korban Pesach, and they're not real. So too, uncircumcised people, they're just not within the category. So I thought about something that is meaningless, and I could just ignore it. Rav Hisda, however, says that it is invalid because even someone uncircumcised is potentially eligible, right? They can go get a circumcision. And therefore, even though in their current state, they cannot bring a Korban Pesach, potentially they could. And since they could, and I have them in mind, but in their current state, which is invalid, therefore that intention has some effectuation, and therefore that makes the Korban invalid. We're looking for a proof for Rabbah and Rav Hisda. Yesterday, Rabbah tried to bring a proof for his own opinion from a long baraita. The baraita was comparing uncircumcised people to an impure person who tries to, if I have in mind impure people, some people that are impure, some are not, then the Korban is valid. Or is uncircumcised more like someone who has intention for piggul, to eat it past its limit. So we went back and forth and we said, you know what, we're going to compare it to someone impure because of the word zot. And that will prove that the prohibition should be limited and therefore should be more lenient. That was the first proof by Rabbah, who applied that baraita. We're going to come back to this baraita today, but Rav Ashi rejected both of these readings. He said the zot is not extra, and so you need it for its place. So we're going to look at Rav Ashi's derivation, and then we'll go back to the baraita and have a discussion over there regarding what kind of impurities we're talking about, impurity of people or impurity of meat. And then we're going to talk about a miscategorization that's not on the 14th, and we'll end with a fantastic story along Agadah that will be a lot of fun. Okay, so we begin here. Ela amar Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi, who rejected the previous proof, says, Rav Hisda v'Rabbah b'hai kera kamipalge. These two opinions have different interpretations of the following pasuk. Regarding a korban olah, says that the owner puts his hands on it, v'nirtzah lo lechaper alav, that it will be acceptable for him on his behalf. So the word lo means only for him, lechaper alav. Alav v'lo al chavero. That means whoever brings it, whoever puts his hands on it and designates it as his, it will effectuate atonement for that person. But it cannot vicariously effectuate atonement for someone else. So if the Kohen has in mind the wrong person, no good. Rabbah sabar chavero du miyadide. Now, Rabbah says it depends, it matters who he had in mind, who else he had in mind. The person who he had wrongly had in mind has to be someone who's similar to the owner. Mahu de bar kapara, av chavero de bar kapara. So I have to bring it. You donated it, and you're within the category of someone who can donate it. But I have in mind someone else who also was in the category of someone who could bring this korban. So if it's a korban pesach, for example, right? So I can bring korban pesach, that's fine. But the uncircumcised person cannot bring a korban pesach. There's no possibility for him. Therefore, even if doing shechita has him in mind, since he's not in the category at all, so that statement is meaningless and we can just ignore it. Therefore, according to Rabbah, the law means only someone similar to you, not someone who is uncircumcised. That person is out totally. So even if I have in mind that person, it's like having in mind that I'm doing this for Mickey Mouse. It's okay. But Rav Hisda Amar, Hai Arel Name, Kevan de Bar Chiyuvahu, Bar Kaparahu, Ho'il, Be'ibae, Metaken Nafshe. Rav Hisda says that an uncircumcised person also, since he potentially would be eligible because he can go and mitaken nafshe, he can fix himself and do circumcision. I mean, it might be dangerous for this person, whatever, but theoretically he could. So he's not categorically outside the realm of Pesach. And therefore, I can have, if I have him in mind that I'm going to do the sprinkling, that the sprinkling will be on his behalf, that is a legally acceptable statement. And therefore, that will be on his behalf, but it's not allowed to be on his behalf because he was not part of the group. You brought this for circumcised people. You cannot bring a korban pesach for him. Since you see it's opposite, right? Since the statement is legitimate because he potentially could bring a korban pesach, therefore I had in mind someone who potentially could bring korban pesach, but I'm not allowed to have him in mind, just like I can't have anyone else in mind who is not currently legitimate. That is Rav Hisda. So basically, they both agree with the pasuk, and they both agree that the pasuk says you cannot bring it for someone else. The question is only, is that someone else, is an adel considered a real other person or not? Rav Hisda says it is. Because he applies the concept of ho'il, that potential is like actual. Even though he's uncircumcised, potentially he would be circumcised, and therefore he is within the category. Okay, we saw this concept of ho'il before, and now we're going to bring it again. In fact, it was the subject of machloket between these two same sages, Rabbah and Rav Hisda, except back when we saw it last, they had the opposite opinion. Mi itled Rav Hisda ho'il, itemar ha'ofe miyom tov lachol. Rav Hisda amar lokeh. Rabbah amar eno lokeh. Well, back then we saw that someone who cooks on Yom Tov for intention that he was going to eat this for lunch tomorrow on Chol, that's a violation of the holiness of Yom Tov. You're not allowed to do that. Everyone agrees they're not allowed to do that. Would the person be liable to lashes? Rav Hisda says yes. He violated cooking on Yom Tov. You're only allowed to cook on Yom Tov for Yom Tov, not for the next day. Rabbah amar eno lokeh. No, he doesn't get lashes. Why? Rabbah amar eno lokeh. Amrinan ho'il v'i mikla'i le orchim hazileh. Since potentially guests could come over, and then he would have food to serve them. So although the guests are not actually there, but potential is like actual. And therefore, even if guests don't come, I cooked in mind with the possibility of guests coming. Therefore, you shouldn't do that, but you're not liable to lashes. And so even if they don't come, I don't get lashes. Rav Hisda amar lokeh, lo amrinan ho'il. Rav Hisda says, you would give lashes to the person that cooks today too much in mind for tomorrow. Because it does not apply the principle of ho'il. It doesn't say potential is actual. If there's no guest there, then you can't say there's potential guest there. So you see the problem that Rabbah in the case of Pesach does not apply ho'il, and on cooking on Yom Tov he does, and Rav Hisda the opposite. So now we're going to have to resolve both of them. Bishlama de Rabbah ad Rabbah la kashya hacha mechusar maaseh hatam de lo mechusar maaseh. Here, in the case of circumcision, it's not really potential. He would actually have to go and do circumcision. You're missing a major component of an action that you have to do. So you don't say he's potentially circumcised. He's just not circumcised. Whereas regarding the guests that came, my job is to cook. It's not in my power for the guests to come or not. They have to decide if they want to. And so therefore, I prepared everything. It's all there. And I don't have to do anything else. If the guests come, they have food. So I can apply the principle of potential when there's nothing further that I could do to bring it about. Ela de Rav Hisda ad Rav Hisda kashya. But Rav Hisda, that's a problem because in the case of Pesach, he does say ho'il. Since he's not circumcised, he could be circumcised, so he's within the category. But regarding cooking, he did not apply ho'il. Rav Hisda made a distinction. He does not apply ho'il for leniency, so that in the case of cooking, if you apply ho'il, then it doesn't get lashes. No, I don't say get that potential is like actual to get you off the hook. You have to get punished. But lechumra, he would apply it. And in the case of when I do shechita, with having in mind I'm going to sprinkle the korban pesach for the sake of these potential people that are not circumcised now but could be circumcised, when I have that intention, if I include them in the category, then the sacrifice becomes invalid. That's a chumrah. So I have to worry about ho'il lechumrah, but I cannot rely on it lekula. All right, good. So that explains that's Rav Ashi's derivation. All right, now we've finished with that. We're going to return to that baraita, not as a proof to this case, but just to analyze the comparisons that were in fact made in that case, and to try to decide, is it we're talking about impure meat or impure people? We're going to go back and forth. Basically, that baraita brought three sets of comparison. The first is, in what case do you say the part is more lenient than the whole? Like if the whole group is problematic, it's no good. But if some of the people can eat and some people can't eat, then it's okay, right? When do you say that? The second basis of comparison is things that don't apply to all offerings, because some offerings, there's some things will be permitted and some offerings not. So which are similar. And another category is which types of problems have no exceptions and which do have exceptions. Okay, so this is the three things that we saw before. Just to remind ourselves for a minute, right? We saw that when some people are impure in the group, it's valid. Now, this does not apply to all offerings, only some. And in that sense, it might be similar to some people that are uncircumcised. However, for piggul, that's something that's past this limit. That's invalid. That's a law that has no exceptions. There are no exceptions to the rule that something past limit will, if I have in mind to slaughter something and eat past this limit, it's invalid. So maybe that should be the similarity with uncircumcised, and that also, there are no exceptions. Okay, so we could go back and forth to compare these. But now we're just wondering about the basis of comparison. What type of impurity were we even talking about in the first place? Okay, so let's see what they have in mind exactly. Amar le mor zutra bere de Rav Mari le Ravina katane ho'il ve'orla poselet v'tum'a poselet. In the Braita, we compared someone who's uncircumcised, in which case if I have them in mind, it's invalid, to someone who's impure. If I have them in mind, also the Korban Pesach is invalid. Ma lo asaba miksat tuma kechol tuma. Just like regarding tum'ah, if it's only some people, it's not like all people. So if it's only some people in the group are tameh, it's okay. So too, orla, if only some people are uncircumcised, it's not as bad as if everybody in the group is uncircumcised. This, if it's only some, it would be okay. And so we compared these two. So hai tumah hechidami. Now I have a question. This tumah that you mentioned, what kind of tumah is it? That is what we thought, that some of the people are tameh, so they cannot bring korban pesach. In what way is it partially okay, but not the whole thing okay? If I have 4 or 5 people in the group and I have them in mind, then they're tameh. And 4 or 5 people in the group and they're tahor, then it's okay. This korban pesach will be valid, right? That's everything what we said. We prove from that since we know it's okay regarding impurity, so too it should be okay regarding a partial group, that some of them are uncircumcised. Ditnan lamulin vela aredim kasher. Now, actually, both of these categories, orla and tameh, we know that they are okay based on our Mishnah, because our Mishnah said lamulin vela arelin kasher. So, ma'ishana tuma de fishita le, or ma'ishana orla de misapeka le. In the Braita, you were assuming that we knew the law regarding impurity. We don't know the law regarding a group that's partially uncircumcised. But in fact, both of them are mentioned explicitly in the same Mishnah. So how is one any more of a solid foundation than the other, that you would assume we know the Tum'ah group, but we don't know the Adel group? So therefore, we must have misunderstood something along the way. And in fact, we're not talking about tameh people, but tameh meat. Ela betum'at basar, right? This lamb, when after it was slaughtered, came into contact with tum'ah. Umay lo asaba miksat tum'ah kechol tum'ah. And so what do we mean in that case when we said that the part is more lenient than the whole? De'ilu itmeh chad me'ebarim, hai de'itmeh sarfinan leh, ve'idach achlinan leh. Well, because if once you separated parts of the animal, if one part becomes tameh, then you would burn it. But the rest, that's tahor, you could still eat it. So the concept of parts are more lenient than the whole, that if the whole animal became tameh, then it's invalid. But if only part of it became invalid, it's okay. And that case was not mentioned in the Mishnah. That we know. That's a solid foundation. And that can then be used to derive another case of part is more lenient than whole, which would be circumcision. Okay, so we're able to resolve that question by assuming we're talking about impurity of meat. Hold on. How did you just establish the braita? Betumat basar. But now let's go to the next case and see if you can be consistent with this. Danin davar she'eno noheg bechol hazevachim, midavar she'eno noheg bechol hazevachim. We should compare two things that have a similarity, that they do not apply to all laws, or all zevachim, to other things that do not apply to all types of zevachim. And leave out the piggul, if I have in mind outside of its time, because that applies to all zevachim. So now, what are the first two categories we had here? Well, they were someone uncircumcised and someone tameh. Those problems are problems for Pesach, because a person has to eat the korban Pesach, but they are not problems for other korbanot, because if someone wants to bring a korban chatat and they're tameh, that's fine. They can just appoint someone and say, bring this for me, and that person can do everything. Or if someone's uncircumcised, they can't bring the korban themselves, but they can appoint someone to do it. So therefore, those two are more similar, and that's why we should compare them for leniency and not compare the piggul. That's what we said. Now, my tuma, inema tumat basar. Now, what kind of tuma is this? If it's talking about impurity of meat, why would you say it does not apply to all sacrifices? All sacrifices would have that same law. Would have the same problem, that it does apply in all any zevach which is impure would be invalid. Ela peshita betumat kavre. Rather, we have to go back to the drawing board and say, no, at least in this clause, we're talking about impure people. And when we say it doesn't apply in all cases, yeah, that's right. Most sacrifices, and someone who's adel tameh can send their sacrifice with someone else. But regarding Pesach, that doesn't work. They have to bring them together. And so that's why adel and tameh are the same. So it makes sense if it's talking about people, not if it's talking about meat. But now we have a problem. Regarding the first comparison, we said it only makes sense if it's talking about impurity of meat. But this second comparison only makes sense if it's talking about impurity of people. Now we have a real inconsistency. In the same baraita, when it says tum'ah as two different definitions from one clause to the next, two answers. In shem tum'ah kaparich. Yeah, there are different types of tum'ah, but they're both tum'ah, and therefore it's legitimate to bring them all together because they have the same name. They're all within the category of tum'ah. And so I'm just trying to consider which law is more similar to this or more similar to that, so I can use the more general category of tum'ah as comparison, even though one case, the first case, talking about tum'ah in the meat, and others talking about tum'ah of the people. Or a second answer if you really like to have consistency. The second comparison also is regarding impurity of meat. And we said that impurity of meat does not apply to all sacrifices. What do we mean? Regarding other zevachim, as long as some part of it, whether if it was the chelev became tameh, but the flesh is okay, and the part that you would eat or kohen would eat, or if it's the meat that became tameh, and it's the chelev that you put in mizbeach that is still tahor. Either way, zorek et hadam. It's a valid korban, and you can still bring the blood. So the partial is more lenient than the whole. However, ve'ilu ba'pesach nitma chelev ubasar kayam zorek et hadam. Nitma basar vechelev kayam eno zorek et hadam. But Pesach is not the same. So you can't say that it applies to all zevachim because it does not apply in Pesach the same way. Regarding Korban Pesach, if the chelev became impure but the meat was still pure and edible, then you can still sprinkle the blood. It's a valid sacrifice. But if the meat, the edible part of the meat became tameh, no good, because Korban Pesach is unique in that it must be eaten. Someone has to eat a kezayit of the meat. And so, therefore, we can even apply the category that we're applying in the second comparison to impure meat, which also does not apply to all zevachim equally. All right, good. Now we're going to get to the third clause. B'mai okimta. What did we just establish? B'tumat basar. The first and second clauses we can explain best according as impure meat. Ema sefa. What about the last comparison? Danin davar shelo hutar mikelalo, min davar shelo hutar mikelalo. We're going to compare one thing that has no exceptions to another thing that has no exceptions from the rule to the rule. But Tumah does have an exception, right? We said if everybody's tameh, then you're allowed to bring a korban, even because everybody's or most people are tameh. Then you don't have to worry about people being tameh. Like Korban Pesach, nowadays technically we could bring it. Okay, b'mai ilema betumat basar hecha hutra. What kind of impurity? If you're talking about impurity of meat, what exception is there regarding impurity of meat that it would be okay? Ela peshita betumat gavre. So this has to be impurity of people. When do we see an exception to the rule? When the community as a whole, most people are impure. So most people are pure, and 1, 2, 3 people, minority people are impure, they're out. But the exception to that rule is if most people are impure, then it's permitted. So there you go. That makes sense if it's talking about people, impurity of people. So resha betumat basar, sefa betumat gavre. The first two clauses we established work best as impurity of meat, but the last clause has to be impurity of people. And again, we have an inconsistency in the Braita. So what are we going to do about that? Two answers. In shem tuma kaparich. It is inconsistent. The first two clauses, the first one has to be meat. The second one we said could go this way or that way, depending on the answer. The third one has to be people. That's okay. We're comparing the concept, the general category of impurity, and within that we can mix and match subcategories because they all are the same thing. But if you really are a stickler for being consistent, we have a final answer. Kula betumat basar, vehecha hutra betumat pesach. In fact, even in impurity of meat, there is an exception to the rule when it comes to Korban Pesach. Ditnan, Pesach haba betum'ah, nechal betum'ah, shelo ba metechilato ela la'achila. If a Korban Pesach is brought and the meat itself becomes impure, it can be eaten in impurity because that was the whole point of the Pesach is that it must be eaten. So you don't want it to be impure, but if it is still a valid sacrifice. So you see, even in meat impurity, there is an exception. And so now we're able to explain all three comparisons in that Braita, that when it says impurity, it's talking about impurity of the meat, not of the people. Okay, good. Now we have a question. Mativ Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua. HaPesach she'avra shenato. Okay, this is now a new case altogether. And this is a miscategorized sacrifice that's not on the 14th, right? Remember, we said that if you bring something on the 14th, then you have to designate it as a Pesach sacrifice and have in mind that you're doing all the steps as a Pesach sacrifice. If it's not on the 14th, however, then you have to have an invalidating intention. You have to have in mind that this is a shilamim. So that will undo the original Pesach designation during the rest of the year. Okay, so now we're going to see another case like that. HaPesach she'avra shenato ushchato bizmano lishmo. So a Korban Pesach has to be less than 1 year old. That's the law. So what if I had something I designated as a Korban Pesach, but then I waited and waited, I didn't bring it on Pesach, and now by time the next Pesach came around, it's more than a year old. So I did shechita bizmano on the 14th of Nisan, and I had in mind this will be a Korban Pesach. The problem is the animal is not the right type. It's more than a year old. What happens? Can it just default to a shalamim? Second case, v'chen hashochet acherim l'shem Pesach bizmano. Or if I take a different offering, an offering that I designated at first as a shalamim, and then I do shechita on the 14th of Nisan as a Korban Pesach, is that also okay? And it will default as a shalamim? Can't be a Pesach because I didn't designate it as a Pesach. But is it invalid altogether, or is it valid as a shalamim? Machloket. Rabbi Eliezer posel, Rabbi Yoshua machshir. Okay, we understand Rabbi Eliezer who's posel. It's not the right kind. You mixed and matched, right? It was the animal type for something else, and you said that's going to be a Korban Pesach, and it's on the 14th, so it's no good. But Rabbi Yoshua says it's okay. Why? It seems that according to Rabbi Yoshua, from the fact that there was something off about it, that actually is helpful. Because it was either too old or was the wrong kind, it doesn't matter that I said it's going to be a Korban Pesach. That doesn't effectuate anything. It doesn't matter. It would be the same if I did it any other day of the year, in which case the misdesignation is actually could be helpful. And Korban Shalamim is a catch-all, and it can default to be that and is valid. Okay, so now regarding this machloket, ta'ama bizmano, they only argued regarding a case when I did shechita on the 14th. Hashelo bizmano kasher. That means in the rest of the year, if I take this animal that I had designated as a Korban Pesach, but it got too old, or if I designate it as a shalamim, but now I do shechita as a Pesach. Both of these I do shechita as a Pesach, but it's not the 14th. Then kasher. Even Rabbi Eliezer would agree it's kasher because it's not Pesach. So whatever I say that it's Korban Pesach, it's nonsense. We can ignore it. But why? Why does everyone agree it's okay? Rabbi Eliezer should have the principle of ho'il. Potential is like actual. And so to here, since potentially, if it was the 14th of Nisan to be pasul, then why don't we say now also that it's not the 14th, should it also be pasul? That is this question. Why don't we apply the concept of ho'il? Amar Rav Papa, Shane Hatam Damar Kera, V'amartem Zevach Pesach Hu B'havayato, Lo Hu L'Shem Acherim, V'lo Acherim Lishmo. So he explains the reason why Rabbi Eliezer would make a difference is because the pasuk says on Pesach, on Erev Pesach, you say this is Korban Pesach. V'amartem. You have to designate it as Korban Pesach, but this law only applies on the 14th when we are making Korban Pesach. So in that case, since it makes sense that I need to designate something as Korban Pesach, if I designate an animal as Korban Pesach that's not a good animal, then it's going to be invalid. But the rest of the year, where I'm not designating anything because of Korban Pesach, there's no mitzvah to do that. That designation does not effectuate at all. So only it, behabayato, and not when it's for the sake of something else, and not when it's something else for its sake, meaning the rest of the year, when it's a shelamim or an older offering. If I do it for Korban Pesach, I don't have to worry about that. Okay. Now, bizmano shu pasul leshum acherim poslim lishmo. Shelo bizmano shu kasher l'shom acherim, acherim kesherim lishmo. We're just filling out the proof there that on Pesach itself, if I have in mind the different type of korban, it's no good. I have to have in mind korban Pesach. So on Pesach itself, other animals that I make for Pesach, a shelamim that I make for Pesach, is also going to be pasul, because there's an analogy between those. When it's not bismano, and in that case, shu kasher l'shum acherim, that if I take a Pesach and I have in mind that this will be a shelamim, that's good. I actually need to do that. So too, a shelamim, or an older animal that I designate le Pesach, is also okay. And so that's his derivation why it's permitted. All right, so we got the halacha, and now that halacha is this case is gonna come up within a story, but the story itself is independent and encompasses other interesting aspects. So here's the story. Rabbi Simlai, he was famous for his Agadah, first generation Amorah. He's famous for saying that there are Tariag mitzvot. He's the first one to say that. Anyway, another thing he did is Atala Kamed Rabbi Yochanan. Amar le nitni li mor sefer Yochasin. He says, Rabbi Yochanan, will you please teach me the book of genealogy? The book of genealogy, we don't have this book anymore, but this seems to be a midrash on the Tanakh. Whenever the Tanakh gives genealogies and gives names of people, especially in Divrei Yamim, where a lot of it is just chapters and chapters of names. And everybody, we wonder today, what's the purpose of all these names? Why do we need to know that? They're not mostly famous people. They don't come up again, right? What's the holiness? What's the long-term prophetic need to know these names? So Sefer Yochasin is a midrash that interprets all those names allegorically. They're not referring to specific actual people. They're referring to concepts. And so this is a very deep midrash and very difficult because every name has another meaning. Okay, so he says, please teach me this complex book. Amale mehechanat. Yochanan says, where are you from? Male milod. I'm from Lod, right, where the airport is. But this was actually a very old city in Israel. That's where I'm from, in the south, in Judea. And where do you live now? I live in Bavel. I have a rule, we have a principle that we don't teach things to people from Lod or to people from Nehar De'ah. And you are disqualified on both counts. Right? You're not worthy. So he said, no, I'm not teaching you. But the student was persistent. He forced him. He wouldn't let him go. No, you got to teach me. You got to teach me. Yochanan says, finally, he says, okay, I will teach you Sefer Yochasin, even though I don't think you're going to handle it. Then, once the teacher agreed, the student said, I want you to teach me the whole thing in 3 months. Now the student already has demands on the teacher, right? You got to teach me, I want to do the whole thing quickly. Shekal kala petak ber. Rabbi Yochanan took some earth and threw it in his face, right? He's insulted. Amar le, oma Beruriah. Debitu de Rabbi Meir, Berater Rabbi Yechananya ben Tarajon, Detanya telat me'ah shematata biyoma, mitelat me'eh rabavta, says, what, you think you can learn all this material in 3 months? Compare yourself to Beruriah. She was the wife of Rabbi Meir, the great Tana, the daughter of Rabbi Yechananya ben Tarajon, one of the martyrs killed by the Romans. And we learned that she studied, right, who studied 300 traditions in a day from 300 sages, right? She was able to incorporate so much study, right? 300 times 300. I guess it's on 300 days. She learned 300 things from different rabbis, each on a day, and she was able to memorize each and every, all of it, and absorb it. So you see how brilliant she was. And yet, when she came to study the book of Yochasin, she could not do it in 3 years, right? That took her. And even that was not enough for her. And you, who surely are not on the level of Beruriah, you can't learn all that much. There's no way that you can do it in 3 months. This is silly. And so he said, get out of here. Okay, so Rabbi Simlai, he ruined his chance, but he didn't want to spend so long studying it anyway. So Kishakil va'azel amar le. While Rabbi Simlai was walking out, he says, let me not leave empty-handed. Let me at least learn something from Rabbi Yochanan. He says, okay, I have a question just about a halacha. Rabbi, ma ben lishmo v'shelo lishmo, le'ochlav v'shelo le'ochlav. what's the difference in our Mishnah that we just learned previously? It says if I have in mind, and when I do shechita, I have in mind that this will be for Korban Pesach and not for Korban Pesach. I have a mixed message, that's invalid. But if I have in mind, I'm going to do shechita for some people who can eat it and some people who are too sick and they cannot eat it kezayit. In that case, it's okay. What's the difference? Rabbi Yochanan says, I will answer your question. I can tell from your question that you're a thinker, you're a sage, and you're worthy to teach. So this I will teach you. Ta ve'emalach, lishma ve'shelo lishma, pesulo begufo. Le'ochlav ve'shelo le'ochlav, and pesulo begufo. Regarding intention of this is Pesach or not a Pesach, that's an invalidation in the body of the animal. The definition of this animal, is it going to be, what kind of korban is it? Pesach or not? That's a big problem. But when I have in mind those who will eat it, that's an external problem. It's not internal to the animal, but happens to be there are some people I had in mind who cannot eat it. That is easier to ignore. It's not a problem in the animal itself. That's why that's more lenient. A second thing is going to bring a second difference. Lishma v'shelo lishma, efshar lebarer isura. Regarding, as I say, this is a Pesach and it's not a Pesach. So the animal itself, I can't go and take it apart and say, well, this leg is for Pesach, but this bone is not for Pesach. It's the whole thing. I can't separate the proper and improper parts. But if I have in mind the whole group of people, I know these 4 people can eat. These 4 people are not capable of eating. And so I can separate them out and I can exclude them. And that's why I can be more lenient in that case. Furthermore, regarding having the improper intention of what kind of korban it is, Pesach or not, I have to have proper intention in all 4 of the activities I do: slaughtering, receiving, carrying, and sprinkling the blood. Whereas regarding who I'm doing it for, that does not apply to all the people, because it doesn't matter when I'm sprinkling. The sprinkling has nothing to do with the eating. So if I'm sprinkling in mind for people who can't eat it, it doesn't matter. So that's another way in which it's more lenient. Also, lishmo v'shelo lishmo yeshno besibur kibiyachid, lo'ochlav v'shelo lo'ochlav eno besibur kibiyachid. The first one applies both to communal sacrifices and to individual sacrifices. If I have in mind those who can eat and those who cannot eat, because both and the communal sacrifices also can be eaten. However, when I have in mind that this with the category of what type of korban it is, that will invalidate no matter what kind of korban it is. If it's a korban tamid, which is a communal sacrifice, and I have in mind it's going to be something else, that's invalid. So that the wrong type of animal, the wrong type of korban invalidates in all cases. Whereas if I have in mind the wrong eaters, someone that's something that's a korban sibur has no owner, and so therefore I have in mind that those 3 people will eat it. Doesn't matter. It's communal. It belongs to everybody. And if it's one that must be eaten, those kohanim who can eat it will eat it. So it does not apply korban sibur. Only applies to korban yachid, where it's that individual that would have to eat it, like korban pesach. Okay, so that was a good answer, right? Rabbi Yochanan brought several differences to explain the question of Rabbi Simlai. Excellent. Now that we have that, Rav Ashi makes an observation. Rav Ashi amar pesulo begufo ve'i efshar levarer isuro hada miletahi. Although he made a whole list of derivations, actually 2 of them are in fact the same thing. When you say that it's the invalidation inheres in the body of the animal, and the fact that you cannot separate one part from the other, that's actually the same thing. It's because of the one necessitates the other, right? Because why do we say that it's inherent in the animal? Because the whole animal is now designated as the wrong thing, not any one part of it. So I can't separate one thing and the other, as opposed to when it's people, then I can separate these people are okay, these people are not okay. Okay, good. Amar Ameh. בא רב יהודה אמר רב ביום שנגנז ספר יוחסין תשש כוחן של חכמים וחהה מאור עיניהם. Now that you mentioned this book of Yochasim, I'll tell you a little bit more about it. That from the time that it was hidden, like people were misunderstanding it. Perhaps the allegories were too out there, and it was leading people to take other things allegorically. And so they hid this away and didn't teach it anymore. And so since that time, the strength of the sages has been weakened and the light of their eyes has been dimmed, right? So, maybe they had to hide it away, but we also lost a lot of important material there, unfortunately. Amar Mor Zutra, ben asel le'asel, te'ainu arba me'a gamle didrasha. Just as one example between these two pisukim in Divrei Yamim, 838, it mentions the word Atzel, where it says Atzel had 6 sons and names the sons. Okay, and later in the next chapter, 944, has the same pasuk. Atzel had 6 sons. So first of all, why are these pasukim repeating themselves? And actually, even within the pasuk, it starts with Atzel and ends with Atzel. So he says this one section of names that used to have 400 camel loads of explanations. If you'd write them down, it would take 400 camels to carry all of the explanations we had just for this short section of words. That's how much Torah was there. That's why it took so long to explain it, more than 3 years. But that's how much we lost from this fantastic Torah. All right, we don't have the book of Yochasin, but at least we have these stories that tell us something about the book of Yochasin. Baruch Adonai L'olam, Amen ve'amen.